Sometimes the hardest thing a person can do is speak one honest sentence after years of staying quiet. It is deeply painful when fear teaches good people to hide their hearts just to avoid being laughed at, ignored, or left behind. In these stories, you are going to hear from writers who got tired of living behind careful masks and old survival habits that were never truly keeping them safe. You will hear what happens when silence stops feeling protective and starts costing them something real. And later in this video, one writer will say the one sentence he thought would destroy everything, only to learn he was not the only one waiting in that silence. That is what makes this journey matter so much, because accountability is coming, truth is coming, and peace begins the moment someone stops shrinking to make life easier for everybody else. So settle in, take a breath, and let us step into the first story together. I treated my feelings like a controlled experiment because I was too afraid to feel anything real. I was already halfway through my sentence when I realized there were 30 people watching me crash and burn. And that exact memory has been running in the background of my life like corrupted software ever since. Because that was the day Lauren Mitchell laughed. Not just a polite, awkward laugh, but a sharp, echoing one, and said, "Wait, you're serious?" While her friends stared at me like I'd just confessed to something criminal. And I remember the heat crawling up my neck, the way my hands went numb, and how I muttered something like, "Never mind," before walking out of that lecture hall knowing I had just permanently rewritten how I interacted with people. After that, I didn't just avoid rejection. I archived it, categorized every risk, every glance, every possible misstep as data points in a system designed to prevent that exact humiliation from ever happening again. And it worked, at least on paper, because for years I became the guy who was easy to be around but impossible to actually know. The guy who joked, helped, showed up. But never stepped forward, never crossed that invisible line where things could break, and nobody really called me out on it, because from the outside it just looked like I was chill, or low drama. But the truth was I was terrified of repeating that one moment where the entire room turned into a mirror, reflecting how stupid I looked for thinking I could be wanted. Fast forward 6 years and I'm sitting across from Maya Singh at a small restaurant that smells like grilled garlic and cheap wine. And she's talking about her job in a way that makes her hands move a lot, like she's trying to shape the air into something real. And I'm nodding, responding, doing everything right, except there's this pressure building in my chest, because I've known for months that I'm in love with her. Not in the casual, she's great, way, but in the kind that makes everything else feel like background noise. And I also know, with absolute certainty, that if I don't say something now, I'm going to lose whatever chance exists because she's been pulling back slightly. Not dramatically, but enough that I can feel it, like she's waiting for something I haven't given. The worst part is that Maya isn't like Lauren. She's never mocked me, never made me feel small. In fact, she's been patient in a way that almost feels intentional, which somehow makes it more dangerous because if I mess this up, I'm not just reliving an old humiliation, I'm losing someone who actually matters. So instead of acting like a normal person, I did what I always do. I tried to turn it into a system, a controlled risk. And about 2 weeks before that dinner, I literally opened a note on my phone titled Confession Variables, where I listed outcomes like I was preparing for a presentation, best case mutual interest. Neutral case polite rejection with maintained friendship, worst case social fallout and permanent disengagement, and I even assigned rough probabilities like that would somehow make it less terrifying. But the reality was I was stalling, hiding behind analysis because action meant exposure, and exposure meant the possibility of becoming that guy in the lecture hall again. The shift happened earlier that same day when my friend Daniel Reyes, who has zero patience for my overthinking, looked at me after I bilayed on telling Maya for the 3rd time and said, "You're not protecting yourself, you're just guaranteeing nothing happens," and something about that stuck. Not because it was profound, but because it was accurate in a way I couldn't dodge. And I realized my whole archive system wasn't preventing pain, it was just locking me into a version of life where nothing meaningful could actually start. So by the time I was sitting there with Maya, listening to her talk about a coworker's ridiculous email habits, I made a decision that felt less like courage and more like flipping a switch I'd been avoiding for years. And I interrupted her mid-sentence, which I never do, and said, "Hey, I need to try something and I'm probably going to sound weird, but I don't want to keep avoiding this." And she stopped, really stopped, like her whole attention snapped into place. And that alone almost made me backtrack, but I pushed through because I knew if I hesitated I'd default back into safety. I told her as plainly as I could that I had feelings for her, that I'd been avoiding saying anything because I was afraid of screwing up what we had, and that I was framing this as a one-time experiment in just being honest without trying to control the outcome. And even as I said it, I could feel that old panic rising, the same heat, the same tightening in my chest, except this time there was no audience, just her, which somehow made it more intense because there was nowhere to hide. The silence after I finished felt like it stretched for minutes, even though it was probably a few seconds. And in that gap, my brain started firing off every worst-case scenario I'd ever catalogued, telling me I'd misread everything, that I was about to lose her completely, that I'd proven I hadn't learned anything. Then she exhaled, and what she said next didn't match any of my prepared outcomes. She looked at me with this mix of relief and something softer and said, "I was starting to think you were never going to say it." And for a second I didn't even process it, because it didn't fit the script I'd built in my head, and I actually said, "Wait, what?" like an idiot, and she laughed, not like Lauren. Not sharp or dismissive, but warm, almost amused, and explained that she'd liked me for a long time but didn't want to push because she could tell I was holding something back, that every time things got close to shifting into something more I'd subtly pull away, and she didn't want to force it or risk losing me entirely, so she'd been waiting, giving me space to get there on my own. The realization hit me all at once, that all those years of treating vulnerability like a threat to be neutralized had created a completely false reality where I assumed rejection was the default outcome, when in this case the real risk had been doing nothing, letting something real fade because I was too busy protecting myself from a version of the past that wasn't even relevant anymore. I wish I could say I handled the rest smoothly, but I didn't. I stumbled over my words, asked if she was serious twice, probably looked like I'd just run a marathon, but none of that mattered because the core thing had already shifted. The part of me that believed speaking up would automatically lead to humiliation got proven wrong in a way no amount of analysis could have achieved. We stayed at that restaurant for another 2 hours, talking in a way that felt completely different from before, like there was no longer a layer of insulation between what I thought and what I said. And when we finally left, walking out into the cool night air, she reached for my hand, and that small, simple action felt more significant than anything else, because it was something I had spent years convincing myself wasn't available to me. The strangest part is that the fear didn't disappear. It's still there, still tries to whisper worst-case scenarios when things feel uncertain. But now I have a counterexample that's stronger than all the archived failures, a moment where taking the risk didn't lead to collapse but to connection. And I think that's the part nobody tells you, that you don't eliminate vulnerability by avoiding it. You just starve yourself of the experiences that prove your fears aren't absolute. And if I hadn't treated that confession like a deliberate, one-time experiment, I probably would have found another reason to wait, another variable to analyze, another safe excuse, and eventually Maya would have moved on, not because she didn't care, but because I never gave her anything real to respond to, and I would have added that to my archive too, labeled it as another example of why not trying was safer, completely missing the fact that the failure would have been mine, not the world's. Instead, for once, I stepped out of that system, said the thing I was most afraid to say, and got an answer I never would have predicted, which is honestly the only reason I'm writing this, because if you're wired like me, you're probably building your own archive right now, convincing yourself you're being rational when you're actually just being safe. And I'm telling you, as someone who spent years doing exactly that, the data is incomplete until you're willing to risk adding a different kind of result. What made that first ending so powerful was not just that Maya stayed, it was that the writer finally stopped letting Lauren Mitchell and all that old humiliation run his whole life. He was brave enough to see that his careful system was not wisdom at all. It was fear wearing a smart face, and once he chose honesty, that false protection lost its grip. That kind of moment matters, because the people who mock or wound us early often leave behind rules that keep hurting us long after they are gone. But when a writer sets down those old rules and speaks plainly, the whole future can change in one quiet conversation. Now we move into another story where silence was built even deeper, where feelings were not just feared but swallowed for years. Let us take a breath and read the next story together. I learned to swallow every feeling I ever had, so saying, "I want you," felt like jumping off a building. The first time I almost told Jordan how I felt, my throat literally locked up like it used to when my dad would ask why I was upset, and then stare at me until I said, "I'm fine." Because in our house, feelings weren't something you shared, they were something you survived quietly. And that habit followed me into adulthood so cleanly that by the time I met Jordan, I had already perfected the art of being unreadable, of laughing at the right moments and never lingering too long on eye contact, of acting like nothing mattered even when everything did. And the problem was Jordan noticed me anyway, which made it worse because I wasn't used to being seen. Not like that. Not in the small ways that matter, like remembering I hated coriander or that I always tapped my fingers when I was nervous. And I kept thinking if I just played it cool long enough it would either fade or explode on its own so I wouldn't have to choose. But it didn't, it just grew heavier, like carrying something fragile you're terrified to drop but too stubborn to set down. And then came that night at Olivia's birthday when everything shifted from manageable to unbearable because Jordan showed up late, hair still damp from a shower, laughing with Marcus at the door, and I felt this sharp, immediate panic that someone else might say the words I couldn't. That I'd lose something I never even admitted I wanted. And that's when I realized silence wasn't protecting me anymore. It was actively costing me something real. But even then I did what I always did. I stayed quiet, I made jokes, I played the role, until Jordan cornered me on the balcony with 2 drinks and said, "You always disappear when things get loud." And I shrugged like it was nothing, like I hadn't been disappearing my whole life. And Jordan just looked at me for a second in this way that made me feel transparent, like they could see the version of me I kept buried. And then they changed the subject, which should have been a relief but somehow felt worse, like I'd just missed a door opening, and the rest of the night blurred until it was just me walking home alone, replaying that look over and over, and something in me snapped, not loudly, not dramatically. Just a quiet internal shift where I got tired of being the guy who never said anything and then wondered why nothing ever changed. So I decided I was going to tell Jordan, not someday, not when it felt easier, but the next time I saw them. Which turned out to be 2 days later at this small coffee place we both liked. And I almost backed out the second I saw them because my body went straight into that old pattern, heart racing, chest tight, every instinct screaming to shut up and smile and keep things safe. But I forced myself to sit down anyway, hands shaking so badly I had to wrap them around my cup to hide it. And Jordan noticed immediately. Of course they did, they always did, and they said, "Hey, what's going on?" In this calm, steady way that somehow made it harder because it meant I didn't have an excuse to deflect. And I tried, I really did. I made some comment about work, about being tired, but my voice cracked halfway through and I just stopped. And there was this long, horrible silence where I could either retreat like I always had or finally do something different. And I swear it felt like standing on the edge of something high enough to kill me if I jumped. And then I heard myself say it, clumsy and uneven. "I think I like you, like, I want to date you." And immediately I wanted to take it back because it sounded so small compared to how big it felt inside me. Like I'd reduced this massive, consuming thing into a weak sentence. And I braced for rejection, for awkwardness, for that subtle shift where people pull away and pretend nothing happened. But Jordan didn't do any of that. They just stared at me for a second and then smiled in this soft, almost relieved way and said, "I was wondering when you'd finally say something." And I blinked because that wasn't the script I'd prepared for, not even close. And I said, "What do you mean?" And they leaned forward slightly and said, "You try really hard to seem like you don't care about anything, but it's obvious you do, especially with me." And I felt this immediate urge to deny it, to laugh it off, but I couldn't because they were right, and that was the terrifying part. They had seen through years of practiced indifference like it was nothing, and instead of being turned off by it. They continued, "It actually made me care more, not less." And that hit me harder than any rejection could have because I had built my entire personality around the idea that vulnerability pushed people away, that showing interest made you weak. And here was someone telling me the exact opposite, and I didn't know what to do with that. So I just sat there, stunned, and Jordan reached across the table. Not dramatically, just enough to rest their hand near mine. Not touching yet, like they were giving me the option, and said, "I like you too, but I didn't want to push you because it felt like you were protecting something." And I laughed, this awkward, shaky sound, and said, "Yeah, that sounds about right." And for the first time I actually explained it, not everything, but enough, about how in my house feelings were ignored until they disappeared or turned into something else. How I learned early that saying what I wanted usually led to silence or dismissal, and how that made it easier to just never say anything at all. And Jordan listened, really listened, without interrupting or trying to fix it. And when I finished they said, "That makes sense, but you know you don't have to do that here, right?" And I nodded even though I didn't fully believe it yet, because unlearning something that deep doesn't happen in one conversation. But something had shifted, something real, because I had said the thing I'd spent years avoiding and the world hadn't ended. In fact, it had opened up in a way I didn't expect. And when I finally let my hand rest against theirs, it felt like crossing a line I'd drawn for myself a long time ago, one I never thought I'd step over. And as simple as it sounds, that moment mattered more than anything else. Not because it was perfect or cinematic, but because it was honest. And for someone like me, honesty felt like the riskiest thing in the world, and somehow also the only thing that actually worked. And later that night when I walked home again, same streets, same quiet, it felt completely different, like I wasn't carrying that weight alone anymore. Like I'd finally said something out loud that had been shaping my life in silence for years. And the craziest part was realizing that the thing I feared most, being seen, being known, being vulnerable, was what broke me. It was what finally connected me to someone else in a way I'd never allowed before. And I don't think that fear ever fully goes away, if I'm honest. But now I know it's not a warning sign to stay silent. It's usually a sign that something actually matters, and that maybe, just maybe, it's worth saying anyway. That ending with Jordan was deeply comforting, because the writer did something that felt impossible and found kindness waiting on the other side of it. Jordan did not punish that honesty or rush it, and that is exactly why the old survival habit failed, because shutting down may hide pain for a while, but it also blocks the very care a person needs. The writer was right to finally put real words to real feelings, and that steady choice broke a pattern built in a cold home where being open never felt safe. But some wounds do not begin in silence at home. Some begin in public shame that teaches a person to treat desire like danger itself. So now we step into a story shaped by rejection, memory, and one rule that felt like armor for far too long. Let us read the next story together. I built my entire life around never getting rejected again. Then I broke my own rule, and everything changed. I still remember the exact moment my brain rewired itself for survival, and it's embarrassing how small it was compared to the damage it did. I was 13, standing in a fluorescent hallway that smelled like disinfectant and cafeteria pizza, handing a folded note to a girl named Alyssa Morno while her friends watched like they were waiting for a punchline. I thought I was being subtle. I thought I was being brave. What I actually did was hand her a script, and she performed it perfectly. By lunch, half the school knew. By last period, someone had read my note out loud in the locker room with dramatic pauses, turning my feelings into a joke with perfect timing. I can still hear the laughter. Not loud, not explosive, just constant, like a low hum that followed me for weeks. That day, I built a rule so simple it felt like armor. Never admit interest, never risk exposure, never let anyone see the need. It worked. Through high school, through college, through jobs and parties and late nights that almost turned into something real, I became the guy who was easy to be around but impossible to pin down. I flirted just enough to feel wanted, then pulled back before anything could be confirmed. If someone liked me, they had to say it first, and even then I kept a layer of distance like I was protecting classified information. People called me chill, independent, hard to read. They had no idea I was just terrified of being laughed at again. Then I met Jenna Clark, and for a long time I convinced myself she was just another safe almost. We worked in the same building, different departments, but we kept running into each other in the break room like it was scripted. She had this way of holding eye contact a second longer than normal, like she was waiting for you to say something real. And every time I felt that flicker of panic that said, don't do it, don't show anything, keep it controlled. So I did what I always do. I joked, I deflected, I made sure she knew I enjoyed her company without ever letting it sound like I needed it. It should have stayed that way. It always had before. But Jenna didn't play by the quiet rules I'd set for myself. One evening we got stuck late during a system outage, just the two of us in a half-lit office with the hum of backup power and the city going dark outside. She told me about her last relationship, how it ended because she waited too long to say how she felt, and by the time she did, the other person had already moved on. She said it like it was a fact, not a confession, but there was something under it, something raw that made my chest tighten. I almost said something then. I almost broke my rule right there in that dim office with her sitting across from me, knees pulled up in her chair, looking at me like I was safe to talk to. Instead, I smiled, made a comment about timing, and let the moment pass. Walking home that night, I realized something that scared me more than the idea of rejection. I was about to lose something real because I refused to risk anything. That thought stuck, and it didn't go away. It followed me into my apartment, into my sleep, into every interaction with her after that. I started noticing all the small things I'd been ignoring, like how she'd linger when conversations ended, or how she'd text me random things that didn't need a response but clearly wanted one. And the worst part was realizing she might be doing her own version of what I was doing, hiding behind signals and hoping I'd be the one to make it explicit. That's when the rehearsal started. I must have run that confession 1,000 times in my head. Different versions, different tones, different outcomes. In some, she smiled and said she felt the same. In others, she hesitated just long enough to make it hurt. In the worst ones, she laughed, and suddenly I was back in that hallway at 13, holding a note that turned into a punchline. The night I finally decided to do it, my hands were actually shaking, which felt ridiculous for a grown man who handles pressure at work without blinking. I texted her to meet me at a small cafe we both liked, the kind of place where nobody pays attention to anyone else. I got there early, sat down, and immediately regretted everything. My brain went into overdrive, listing every reason this was a mistake, every scenario where I walked out feeling smaller than when I walked in. When Jenna arrived, she looked normal, relaxed, like this was just another casual meetup, and that somehow made it worse. We talked for a few minutes about nothing, the usual safe topics, and I could feel the window closing, that familiar escape route opening up where I'd make a joke, pay for coffee, and leave things comfortably unresolved. Then something in me just snapped, not in a dramatic way, but in a quiet, final way like a door clicking shut. I realized if I didn't do it right then, I never would. So I interrupted her mid-sentence, which I never do, and said her name in a way that made her stop immediately. My heart was pounding so hard I was sure she could hear it, and for a second I genuinely thought I might just freeze and sit there in silence. But instead I said it, simple and unpolished and completely exposed. I like you not casually, not just as a friend, and I've been trying not to say it because I'm scared of messing this up, but pretending I don't feel it is already messing it up. The moment after that felt like standing on the edge of something with no idea how far the drop was. Jenna just looked at me, and her expression didn't give me anything to work with. No smile, no immediate reaction, just this intense focus that made me feel completely seen and completely vulnerable at the same time. I braced myself for impact, for the polite letdown or the awkward deflection, or, worst of all, the hint of amusement that would confirm every fear I'd been carrying since I was 13. Instead, she let out a breath I didn't realize she'd been holding and said something that completely rewired my understanding of that moment. She said, "I was starting to think you didn't feel anything, and I was too scared to say it first because I didn't want to be the only one. For a second, I didn't process it. Then it hit me all at once, and I actually laughed, not because it was funny, but because it was so absurdly opposite of everything I'd been preparing for. All that time, all those rehearsals, all those defenses, and she'd been standing on the other side of the same wall, waiting for the exact same signal. We ended up talking for hours, not just about us, but about the weird ways we'd both learned to protect ourselves, how easy it is to mistake silence for safety when it's really just distance. I told her about Alyssa and the hallway and the note that turned into a joke, and saying it out loud felt like dragging something old and heavy into the light, and realizing it didn't have the same power anymore. Jenna didn't laugh. She didn't minimize it. She just understood it in a way that made it feel smaller, like it belonged in the past where it happened instead of controlling everything in the present. Walking home that night with her, I realized the rule I'd built my life around had never actually protected me from humiliation. It had just guaranteed I'd never experience anything real enough to risk it. And the craziest part is that breaking it didn't lead to the disaster I'd been avoiding for years. It led to something mutual, something honest, something that only existed because I finally said the one thing I'd trained myself never to say. There is something deeply healing about the way that story ended, because the writer finally saw that one cruel moment from childhood had been controlling years of his adult life. Jenna Clark did not laugh, did not make him small, and that proved the old rule was never a truth about the world, only a wound that had been left unchallenged. It was smart and incredibly strong for the writer to break that rule anyway, because real connection often begins the second we stop obeying the fear that was built by people who hurt us long ago. That lesson leads us naturally into the next story, where the mask is different, not distance through cool control, but distance through pretending not to need anyone at all. And when that mask gets called out in front of other people, everything starts to crack open. Let us read the next story together. I told her I didn't need anyone, and she called me out in front of everyone. I was halfway through telling Maya I didn't do relationships when she leaned forward across the scratched wooden table and said my name like she was pulling it out of my chest. Evan, that's not true. And the way she said it made the whole room feel like it had stopped breathing, like every person at Dylan's birthday party suddenly knew I was about to be exposed for something I had spent years pretending wasn't there. And my first instinct was to laugh it off, to make it a joke, because that's what I always did when something got too close. But she didn't smile, she just held my gaze and waited, and that waiting was what broke me, because I realized she wasn't going to let me disappear this time the way everyone else always had, and I hated how much I wanted her not to. I grew up in a house where silence was safer than honesty, where saying I'm upset or I need this felt like throwing a glass against a wall and then being blamed for the mess. where my mom would nod absent-mindedly while scrolling her phone and my dad would grunt like I was interrupting something more important. So eventually I stopped interrupting, I stopped asking, I stopped expecting anything at all. And by the time I hit my 20s, I had perfected this version of myself that didn't need anyone, didn't want anything, didn't feel much beyond surface level. And people liked that version because he was easy, he didn't complicate things, he didn't demand attention, he didn't get hurt, and I convinced myself that meant I was doing life right, that solitude was a choice and not a defense mechanism duct-taped over something broken. Then Maya showed up at work 6 months ago, new hire, same team, the kind of person who actually noticed things, like the way I always took the last shift without complaining or how I never talked about my weekends, and she started asking questions that weren't invasive but weren't easy to dodge either. And at first I kept it light, sarcastic answers, deflections, but she didn't push harder, she just stayed consistent, like she had all the time in the world for me to catch up, and that messed with me more than if she had been intense, because it meant she wasn't going anywhere. The catalyst, if I'm being honest, happened 3 weeks ago when we were closing up and the power went out during a storm, just the two of us in the dim emergency lighting, and she said quietly, "You're really good at making yourself small," and I snapped back with something defensive. Something about preferring peace over drama, but she didn't argue, she just said, "There's a difference between peace and absence," and that line stuck in my head like a splinter I couldn't dig out, because I knew exactly what she meant and I hated that she saw it. So yeah, by the time we got to Dylan's party and she was sitting across from me with that steady look, I was already on edge, already feeling like I was being slowly uncovered. And when someone asked if we were dating, I defaulted to my script, shrugged, said I wasn't really into that kind of thing. That I liked being on my own, and that's when she said my name and called me out, not loudly, not cruelly, just honestly, and suddenly the stakes felt enormous, like if I doubled down I would lose her for good, and if I told the truth I might lose the version of myself I'd built to survive. I remember my hands actually shaking, which was ridiculous because nothing physically dangerous was happening, but emotionally it felt like stepping off a ledge, like if I said what I was thinking out loud there would be no way to take it back. And the worst part was I didn't even know if she wanted to hear it, or if I was about to embarrass myself in front of a dozen people who would remember this moment forever. And that old voice in my head kept saying, "Your feelings don't matter, nobody's waiting for them." But then I looked at her again and saw that same patience, that same willingness to sit in the uncomfortable space without rushing me, and something shifted. I stopped trying to craft the perfect safe response and just said, "I do want something," and my voice sounded rough, unfamiliar, like it hadn't been used in years for anything real, and the table went quiet, and I forced myself to keep going because if I stopped I knew I'd retreat again. I just don't know how to ask for it without feeling like I'm being too much, and I almost laughed at how pathetic that sounded, but she didn't laugh, she just softened, like that was exactly what she'd been waiting to hear. That was the midpoint, I think, the moment I stopped reacting and actually chose to risk something, and it didn't magically fix everything, if anything it made things harder, because now there was no hiding behind indifference, now I had to follow through. She asked if we could talk outside, and every part of me wanted to say no to escape, but I went anyway, and we stood on Dylan's balcony with the city noise below us and the air still thick from the storm earlier. And I told her more, not everything, but enough, about how I grew up, about how I learned to keep my wants to myself because it was easier than being ignored, and I expected her to either pity me or back away. Because that's what vulnerability had always gotten me before, but instead she said, "I know that feeling." And then she told me about her own version of being overlooked, different details but the same core, the same quiet erasure that teaches you to shrink. And for the first time it didn't feel like I was confessing into a void, it felt like I was being met halfway. The tension didn't disappear right away, there were still moments where I almost shut down, where I second-guessed every word, but she didn't rush me or try to fix me. She just stayed, and that consistency was what finally made it click that maybe I didn't have to earn attention by being invisible. The climax, if you can call it that, came when she said, "So what do you actually want, Evan, not what feels safe to say?" And I realized I had spent so long editing myself that I barely knew the answer, but I took a breath and said, "I want to try this with you," and it felt like jumping without knowing if there was ground beneath me. And there was a beat of silence that felt way too long, and my chest tightened because I thought I had misread everything, that I had just handed her something she didn't want. But then she smiled, small but real, and said, "I was hoping you'd say that," and just like that, the worst-case scenario I had built up for years didn't happen. The resolution wasn't some dramatic kiss or cinematic moment. It was quieter than that. We just stood there talking a little longer, making actual plans instead of vague, sometime promises. And when we went back inside, nothing looked different, but everything felt different because I had crossed a line I never thought I would. I had said what I wanted and the world didn't collapse. She didn't disappear, and I didn't have to pretend I was fine being alone. It's been a month since that night, and I won't pretend I'm suddenly fearless or completely healed. There are still moments where I default to old habits, where I catch myself about to say, it doesn't matter, when it actually does. But now there's someone who notices when I do that and gently calls me back. And more importantly, I notice it too, and I correct it. And every time I choose to speak instead of stay silent, it feels a little less like a risk, and a little more like a normal part of being alive. And I think that's the part I never understood before, that connection isn't about finding someone who fills a void, it's about finding someone who recognizes it and doesn't treat it like something to be ashamed of. And for the first time in my life, I'm not trying to disappear to keep the peace, I'm actually here, wanting something and saying it out loud. Evan earned that ending because he stopped disappearing behind the lie that being alone was easier. Maya was right to challenge him, and her honesty mattered because his whole strategy depended on staying vague, staying small, and never admitting what he truly wanted, but that strategy could only protect loneliness, not love. It was a strong and deeply human choice when he finally said he wanted to try, because that sentence pushed back against years of being overlooked and taught his heart that wanting something does not make him too much. The next story carries that same ache in a different form, with a writer who believes honesty hands another person a weapon. And when trust has been broken before, learning the difference between danger and care can feel like learning how to breathe again. Let us read the next story together. I thought confessing would hand her the knife. Instead, she put it down and took my hand. I was already halfway to the door when Maya said my name like she knew I was about to bolt. And that's when my chest did that tight, electric thing that used to mean danger, like my body remembered before I could think. And for a second I actually checked the room for exits the way I used to when Jenna would start smiling too sweet right before she turned something I told her into a joke for her friends. And I hated that I was doing it again, scanning, calculating, treating a quiet coffee shop like a battlefield, just because a woman I liked was about to hear the truth I had spent 2 years locking down. Maya pushed her cup aside and looked straight at me, not through me, not around me, just steady, and said, "Ethan, if you're leaving, at least tell me why." And that was the catalyst I'd been dreading, because the why was the thing I had promised myself I'd never say out loud again, the thing that had once cost me everything. So I stalled, I shrugged, I made some joke about work. And she didn't laugh, she just waited, and that patience felt more dangerous than anger because it gave me space to either lie or be real. And I knew if I lied I'd keep her but lose whatever this was. And if I told the truth, I might lose her and confirm the rule I'd been living by, which was simple and brutal. If you show someone where you're soft, they will press there until you break. Jenna had proven it with surgical precision, turning my panic attacks into punchlines, my fear of abandonment into a leash she could tug anytime I pulled away. And when it ended, she made sure our mutual friends had a version of me that sounded pathetic, clingy, unstable. And I spent months rebuilding a life that didn't include anyone who knew too much. So by the time Maya showed up at a mutual friend's game night and beat me at everything without gloating. I had rules, boundaries, scripts, and she slipped past them anyway by being consistent in a way that felt unreal. Texting when she said she would, apologizing without defensiveness, asking questions and actually listening to the answers. And that consistency was its own kind of threat because it made me want to believe, and wanting was the first step toward exposure. I sat back down, which felt like stepping into a spotlight I couldn't turn off, and I said, "I'm leaving because I don't do this part." And she tilted her head, not confused, just inviting me to keep going. And my throat went dry because the words were right there, and they felt like handing over a map with all my weak points circled in red. But something in me was tired of living like a locked room. So I forced it out, slow and ugly. I don't tell people how I feel about them, not when it matters. And she didn't fill the silence, she let it sit, which made it heavier, so I added, because the last time I did, it got used against me. And there it was, exposed, and my body braced for the shift, for the micro-expression that says I've given her leverage. For the questions that turn into ammunition later, and I watched her face like it was a weather system about to break, and she just nodded once, like she understood the shape of it without needing the details, and said, "Okay," which was not the response I had rehearsed defenses for, so I pushed harder. almost like I was trying to provoke the betrayal early so I wouldn't have to wait for it. So if I say I like you, like actually like you, that's me doing something I've been avoiding on purpose, and I don't know how to do it without expecting it to blow up in my face. And there it was, the confession, raw and unprotected, and I felt stupid immediately, like I had just handed over the knife and turned my back. The midpoint hit right there because instead of pulling away, instead of probing for more weaknesses, Maya leaned forward and said, "Then don't do it alone." And I blinked because that wasn't in any of my scripts, and she continued, "If you like me, I want to know that, and if you're scared, I want to know that too, but I'm not here to use it against you," and something in me snapped. Not in a breaking way, more like a tension cable finally giving a little, and I heard myself say, "I do like you a lot and it terrifies me." And she smiled, not triumphant, not predatory, just warm, and said, "Good, because I like you too, and it terrifies me a little as well." And I almost laughed because that symmetry felt unreal, like we were speaking the same language without trying to win. The pinch points came fast after that because my brain didn't just accept it. It threw up every warning it had, every memory of Jenna's voice twisting my words, and I found myself asking questions that sounded harsher than I meant. How do I know you won't change your mind and use this later? And she didn't get defensive. She said, "You don't, not right away. Trust isn't a speech, it's a pattern." And that answer landed because it didn't ask me to ignore my past. It gave me something measurable instead, a way to test reality without pretending risk didn't exist. We talked for another hour, and every time I expected a trap, there wasn't one, just clarity. And when I told her about one specific thing Jenna had done, how she'd repeated my worst fear in front of people to get a laugh, I watched Maya's face carefully and saw something like anger, but not at me, and she said, "That's not okay, simple, direct, no spin," and that felt like someone correcting a false rule I'd been living by. The real turning point happened a week later when I had a bad night, the kind where my chest tightens and my thoughts spiral, and my instinct was to disappear, to not let anyone see me like that. But I remembered what she said about not doing it alone, so I texted her just, "I'm not great tonight," which felt like stepping off a ledge, and she replied, "Do you want company or space?" And that question mattered because it gave me control instead of taking it. So I said, "Company," and she came over, sat next to me, didn't try to fix me, didn't make it about her, just stayed. And at one point I realized I had told her something vulnerable without immediately regretting it, and I actually paused because that was new. The absence of punishment felt louder than any betrayal I'd expected. The climax, if there was one, wasn't dramatic. No shouting, no big reveal, just a quiet moment where I caught myself mid-thought, waiting for the other shoe to drop, and recognized that it hadn't, not because I was being naive, but because Maya wasn't following the same blueprint as Jenna, and that realization hit hard because it meant my rule wasn't universal. It was specific to a person who chose to hurt me, and I had turned it into a law I applied to everyone. I told Maya that awkwardly, "I think I've been treating you like you're going to do something someone else did," and she nodded and said, "That makes sense, but I'm not her." And it wasn't defensive, just factual, and that grounded me more than any reassurance could. We've been together 6 months now, which is long enough for patterns to show, and what I've learned is that vulnerability isn't a trap by default. It's a risk that depends on who you're taking it with, and I was right about one thing: confessing does hand someone a map to your weak points. But I was wrong about what everyone does with that map, because some people don't use it to find where to press. They use it to learn where to be careful, and the difference between those two types of people is everything. And I almost missed that because I was so busy surviving the past that I couldn't see the present clearly. If there's any closure to this, it's that I didn't conquer fear by pretending it wasn't there. I did it by choosing, very deliberately, to act in spite of it with someone who showed me, over and over, that my honesty wasn't a liability in her hands, and that doesn't erase what happened before. It just stops it from dictating what happens next. That ending was quietly beautiful because the writer finally saw that Maya was not reaching for the knife he had been trained to expect. She put it down, stayed calm, and gave him a chance to be honest without turning his fear into a punishment, which is why his old rule fell apart so completely. The writer did the right thing by naming the hurt instead of hiding behind it, and that honesty gave trust a real shape instead of a fantasy. The next story carries a different kind of pain, because it is not about fear of betrayal alone. It is about fear of being ordinary, unseen, and replaceable. And when someone hides behind jokes for too long, the heart underneath starts asking for something truer. Let us read the next story together. I stopped being the funny guy for 5 minutes, and it nearly cost me everything. Then it saved me. I was halfway through a joke. I did not even remember starting when I saw her face fall. Not dramatically, just enough that it felt like someone had turned the lights down a notch in the room. And that tiny shift hit me harder than any rejection ever had because it meant she was tired, not angry, not offended, just done trying to find something real in me that I kept burying under punchlines. Her name is Layla, and for almost a year I had built this entire version of myself around making her laugh. Like if I kept the energy high enough, and the conversation moving fast enough, she would never notice there was nothing underneath it. That night we were sitting outside a bar in Melville, traffic humming past, neon reflecting off the pavement, and I remember thinking I should double down, just go bigger, louder, funnier, because that had always worked before. But instead she just leaned back in her chair, looked at me for a second too long and said, "Marcus, do you ever get tired of performing?" And I laughed automatically, like a reflex, and said something stupid about how I charge extra for emotional depth. And that is when I saw it clearly, that flicker of disappointment turning into distance, and something in my chest tightened in a way that felt dangerously close to panic. The truth is I have always been terrified of being ordinary, like if someone saw me without the timing, without the jokes, without the constant motion, they would realize there was nothing worth staying for, and that fear did not come out of nowhere. It came from years of being the quiet kid who got ignored until I figured out that being funny made people look at me, made them stay, made them choose me for a moment, and I guess I never updated that strategy, even when I met someone like Leela who was not looking for a show. She had tried. I can see that now. She would ask real questions, slow questions, the kind that hang in the air and wait for an honest answer, and I would swat them away with something clever, something safe, something that kept me in control, and every time I did that I could feel her pulling back just a little, but I told myself it was fine, that as long as she was still there, still laughing, I was winning. But sitting there that night, watching her not laugh, I realized I was about to lose her in a way that had nothing to do with another guy, or bad timing, or anything external. I was losing her because she had never actually been able to meet me. I wish I could say I handled that realization smoothly, like I took a breath and delivered some perfectly honest line, but it was messier than that. My brain started firing off every defense it had, telling me to pivot, to recover, to get her smiling again. Because that is what kept me safe. But underneath all that noise there was this quieter thought that refused to go away, and it was brutally simple. If you do not stop right now, you are going to watch her walk away from someone you never let her meet. That thought scared me more than rejection ever had, because it meant I had been sabotaging myself the whole time. So I did something that felt completely unnatural. I stopped talking, like actually stopped. No filler, no joke, no redirect, just silence. Leela looked at me like she did not know what to do with that version of me, and honestly neither did I. My hands felt awkward, my chest felt tight, and for a second I considered just laughing it off and going back to what I knew. But then I thought about all the almost moments we had, all the times she had leaned in just a bit and I had pulled away with humor, and I realized this was probably the last chance I was going to get to not screw it up the same way. So I said her name, just Layla, and my voice sounded different, like it belonged to someone who had not been hiding all night. And then I said, "I do get tired of performing. I just do not know how to stop." There was a long pause after that, the kind that would have made me panic before, but I forced myself to sit in it, and she did not interrupt. She just watched me, really watched me, and that somehow made it both easier and harder at the same time. I told her the truth, not all of it in some dramatic speech, just pieces, like how I always feel like I have to earn my place in someone's life by being entertaining, how silence makes me feel like I am about to be forgotten, how I do not actually know if I am interesting without all the extra noise. Saying it out loud felt like taking off armor in the middle of a fight, like I was exposing something that was going to get hit immediately, and I braced myself for that, for her to politely disengage or tell me she just wanted to be friends or anything that would confirm my worst assumption. Instead, she let out this slow breath and shook her head, not in a dismissive way, more like relief, and she said, "I was starting to think you were never going to let me meet you." And that sentence landed harder than anything else because it reframed the entire situation. It was not that I was not enough, it was that I had never actually shown up. I felt this weird mix of embarrassment and clarity, like I had been running the wrong race the whole time. I did not want to slip back into jokes, but I also did not want to overcorrect and turn the moment into some heavy confession spiral, so I kept it simple, probably the simplest I have ever been with anyone, and I said, "I want to date you." Not like this, not as the guy doing bits all the time, just me, whatever that actually is. My heart was pounding so hard it felt like it was shaking my entire body, and for a second she did not respond, which stretched out into what felt like an eternity, and I had to fight the urge to fill that silence, to rescue myself from it. Then she smiled, not the polite smile she gives strangers, but the one that actually reaches her eyes, and she said, "That is all I have been waiting for," and I swear everything in me just dropped, like I had been holding tension for years without realizing it. She told me she liked me for months, but felt like she was always competing with this version of me that never got tired, never got serious, never let anything real land, and she did not want to date a performance, she wanted a person. Hearing that was both validating and brutal, because it meant I had been close the entire time and still almost lost it by being afraid of the exact thing that would have worked. We stayed there for hours after that, and the conversation was slower, sometimes awkward, definitely less polished, but it felt real in a way that made the old version of me seem exhausting. There were moments where I almost slipped back into the pair erive yeruche en yeruikrakui rhythm, throwing in a joke to smooth things over, but I caught myself, and instead I let things be slightly imperfect, slightly uncomfortable, and weirdly that made them better. By the time we left, there was no dramatic moment, no cinematic kiss in the street, just a quiet agreement that we were going to try this for real without the act. Walking home, I kept replaying the night in my head, not the jokes or the near misses, but that one moment where I chose to stop performing because that was the actual turning point, not just with her but with how I show up in general. I am not suddenly cured of that instinct. I still feel it creeping in when things get too quiet or too real, but now I recognize it for what it is, not a strength, not a personality trait, just a shield I do not always need. And the wild part is, the thing I was so scared of, being seen as ordinary, turned out to be the thing that made someone actually choose me. Not the loud version, not the polished version, just me sitting there, a little nervous, a little unsure, but finally honest. That moment with Leela mattered, because the writer finally stopped performing long enough to be known. His jokes had protected him for a while, but they also kept him from the very closeness he wanted, and that is why the old strategy failed the second. He chose silence instead of another punchline. It was brave of him to admit that he was tired, that he wanted to be seen as a person, and not just a source of entertainment, because that kind of truth can feel almost embarrassing when you have spent years hiding behind charm. The next story moves into a different wound, one built on being left before the leaving even happens. That kind of fear can make a person try to end things early just to avoid pain, even when love is finally standing right in front of them. Let us read the next story together. I told Maya I was built to be left, and she did leave. I said it out loud before I could stop myself, like ripping a bandage off skin that never healed right. You're going to leave eventually, so we should just not do this. And I remember the exact way Maya blinked at me across her kitchen counter, like I'd just told her gravity might switch off tomorrow, and I'd already accepted it, like it was normal, like it was math. And that moment right there is where everything should have ended if my life had followed the same script it always had. But it didn't, and that's the part that still messes with me, because I built my entire personality around predicting exits before they happened, around getting ahead of the leaving, around being the one who quietly drifted first, so I could pretend I wasn't abandoned when I inevitably was. And suddenly I was standing in front of someone who refused to follow the rules I'd been surviving by since I was a kid. I grew up in a house where people disappeared like it was routine maintenance. My dad first, just a slow fade into working late, and then into nothing. My mom next in a different way, physically present but emotionally packed up and gone, like she had already decided none of it mattered anymore. And I learned early that attachment was just a countdown clock you couldn't see but could always feel ticking in your chest, so I stopped attaching, or at least I told myself I did. I kept things surface level, friendships that never got too deep, relationships that never crossed into anything real. I became the guy who was easy to like but impossible to keep, because I'd already decided I wasn't staying. Then Maya showed up in the most boring, non-cinematic way possible. She joined our weekly trivia group because her coworker dragged her along, and I barely noticed her at first, except that she laughed like she meant it, and she didn't try to impress anyone, which weirdly made everyone want to impress her. Including me, and over weeks that turned into inside jokes, and then into conversations that lasted after everyone else left, and then into this quiet, steady thing where she started to matter without me noticing when the shift happened, which was exactly the kind of thing I had trained myself to avoid. The catalyst, if I'm being honest, was stupidly small, She texted me one night after a bad day and said, "Can I come over or is that weird?" And I stared at my phone for 10 minutes because that question carried weight. It meant she trusted me. It meant I could become part of her life in a way that had consequences. And every alarm in my head started going off, telling me this was where the pattern always began before it ended. But I said yes anyway, which in hindsight was the first time I actively stepped towards something I was afraid of instead of away from it. She showed up with takeout and a tired smile. We sat on my couch, and somewhere between talking about her awful boss and laughing at dumb videos, she leaned into me like it was the most natural thing in the world, and my body locked up for half a second because this was the moment attachments are born. This was the exact point on the timeline where I usually started planning my exit, and instead of pulling away, I let it happen, which felt less like bravery and more like forgetting to run. After that, things escalated in that quiet, inevitable way: more time together, more shared space, more of her toothbrush in my bathroom, more of me checking my phone hoping it was her, and with every step forward, the pressure in my chest built because I could see the ending already. I could always see the ending. Her getting tired or bored or realizing I wasn't worth the effort, and leaving like everyone else had, and I told myself I was being realistic, not pessimistic, like I had data to back it up, like my past was proof of the future, and the worst part was how convincing that logic felt. The midpoint, the moment everything pivoted, was a random Tuesday when she casually said, "So are we dating or are we just aggressively hanging out?" And she smiled when she said it, but I felt like I'd just been cornered because that question demanded a commitment, a label, a step I couldn't take without acknowledging how much I had to lose. And that's when I said it, that line, that stupid, honest, terrifying sentence, "You're going to leave eventually, so we should just not do this." And I expected her to get offended or hurt or just quietly agree and pull back, because that's what people do when you hand them an exit. Instead, she set her fork down, leaned back against the counter and said, "Ethan, that's not a reason, that's a fear." And I remember feeling this weird mix of anger and panic, because she had just dismantled the foundation of how I made decisions, like she'd exposed the cheat code I'd been using to avoid getting hurt, and I pushed back. I told her she didn't understand, that people always leave, that it's just how things go, and she didn't argue in a dramatic way. She just said, "I'm here right now, and I'm choosing to be here tomorrow too, and if something changes, we deal with it then, but I'm not going to leave just because you've already decided I will." That should have scared me off completely. Because she was refusing to play along with my script, and for a couple of days I actually tried to create distance, shorter texts, excuses not to meet up, the usual slow fade I'd perfected, but she didn't chase me in a desperate way. She just stayed consistent, still kind, still present, still inviting me into her life without forcing it. And that consistency started to crack something in me because it didn't match my expectations. It didn't give me the justification I needed to bail, and I realized I was standing at a fork where one path was the same lonely safety I'd always chosen, and the other was risk with no guarantee, and for once, I couldn't convince myself the safe option was actually better. So I went back to her apartment, knocked on her door with my heart doing something between a sprint and a collapse, and when she opened it, I didn't try to sound composed or logical. I just said, "I want to try, even if it ends badly," which was probably the most honest thing I'd ever said to anyone. And she smiled in this soft, relieved way and said, "Okay, we'll try," like it was simple, like it didn't require dismantling years of defensive wiring, like it was just two people agreeing to see what happens. The escalation after that wasn't about external drama, it was internal. Every good moment came with a shadow of expectation. Every time she laughed or held my hand or made plans for next week, there was a voice in my head saying, "This is what you'll miss when she's gone," and I had to actively fight that narrative. Had to keep choosing to be present instead of bracing for impact, and there were moments I almost sabotaged it, picking small fights, withdrawing, testing if she'd leave, because part of me wanted to prove myself right, because being right meant being prepared, and being wrong meant admitting I'd been living in a self-made cage. The climax wasn't explosive, it was quiet and honestly kind of mundane, which is why it hit so hard. We were sitting on my balcony one evening, nothing special, just watching the city settle into night, and I realized I wasn't scanning for signs of her pulling away. I wasn't calculating how much time we had left. I was just there with her, and for the first time in my life, the future didn't feel like a countdown to loss. It felt open, uncertain in a way that wasn't automatically negative, and that's when it clicked that the forecast I'd been trusting wasn't a prediction, it was a habit, and habits can be broken. I told her that in a clumsy way, something like, "I think I've been expecting storms that aren't actually coming," and she leaned her head on my shoulder and said, "Then maybe you can start checking the weather with me instead of assuming it's always bad." And it sounds cheesy when I repeat it, but in that moment, it felt like someone had handed me a completely different way to exist. We've been together a while now, long enough that my old instincts still show up but don't control me, long enough that I've had to accept that nothing is guaranteed, not even this, but also long enough to see that expecting abandonment doesn't prevent it. It just guarantees you experience it whether it happens or not. And I'm done living like that. I'm done pre-grieving relationships that haven't ended. And if Maya ever does leave, I'll deal with it when it's real instead of living it every day in advance. But for now, she's here. She keeps choosing to be here. And for the first time, I'm choosing that back without an exit plan. What made that ending so strong was how Maya refused to let Ethan turn fear into prophecy. He had built his whole life around leaving first so he would never feel abandoned, but her steady presence proved that his old rule was never a law, only a wound trying to sound wise. The writer was right to admit he wanted to try, because that choice opened the door to something real instead of another lonely escape. The next story carries a similar ache, but this time the fear is not just about being left, it is about speaking up before the chance disappears. And when someone has spent years treating desire like something shameful, one honest sentence can feel like stepping out into the cold. Let us read the next story together. Shame was my strategy until she said, "Okay." I realized I was about to ruin the one good thing in my life when I heard my own voice start to shake halfway through saying her name. Sarah looked up from her laptop, calm as always, like I hadn't just detonated something between us, and that almost made it worse because I was already bracing for the hit, for that familiar tightening in my chest that said I had crossed a line I wasn't supposed to cross. I had spent years training myself not to get to this point with anyone, not to let things slip past that safe, numb edge where nothing could be used against me. And yet there I was, standing in her apartment, heart hammering like I had done something wrong just by wanting more than what we already had. It sounds dramatic, but if you grow up learning that your feelings are something to be laughed at or punished, your brain wires itself around avoidance like it's survival, and for me it always had been. My dad used to call me soft, anytime I showed even a hint of interest in someone, like attraction itself was some kind of weakness, and my mom wasn't much better, always asking in that fake sweet voice who I thought I was impressing, like the idea that someone might actually like me back was ridiculous. So I learned fast, keep it in, don't say anything, don't risk it. By the time I got to college, I was an expert at almost connections, the guy who hovered just close enough to feel something but never close enough to be seen. And then I met Sarah, and everything got complicated in the worst way because she didn't play those games. She just existed, open and steady, asking questions and actually listening to the answers, like emotions weren't something to be hidden or weaponized. At first I treated her like everyone else, kept things light, deflected anything real with jokes, but she had this quiet persistence that made it hard to stay guarded. She remembered things I said in passing. She noticed when I pulled back. She didn't push, but she didn't let me disappear either. And slowly, against my better judgment, I let her in just enough that being around her started to matter more than my usual safety routines. That was the problem, because once something matters, it becomes a risk, and I am very good at identifying risks. For months, I convinced myself I could keep it contained, that whatever I felt would eventually burn out or fade like it always did when I kept it unspoken. But it didn't. It grew quietly, stubbornly, until every normal interaction started to feel like pressure building under the surface. Sitting next to her on the couch watching a movie felt like balancing on a wire. Hearing her laugh at something I said felt like a reward I hadn't earned. And the worst part was knowing that the longer I stayed silent, the more I was lying by omission, pretending I was just her friend when every instinct in me had already crossed that line. The catalyst, I guess, was stupidly small. She mentioned going on a date with someone from work. Just casually, like it was nothing. But I felt it immediately, this sharp drop in my stomach, like I had just watched an exit door close that I didn't even admit I was standing near. I laughed it off in the moment, made some comment about finally meeting someone who could tolerate her obsession with terrible reality shows, and she smiled, but something in me snapped into focus right then. I knew exactly what was going to happen if I did nothing. I would stay quiet, she would move on. I would tell myself it was for the best, and then I would carry that quiet regret around like I always did, another piece of proof that I was safer invisible. That's when I realized the shame wasn't protecting me anymore. It was actively costing me something real. So I made a decision that honestly felt like stepping off a ledge. I told her I needed to talk. And now here I was, mid-sentence, voice already betraying me, every instinct screaming that I needed to stop before I embarrassed myself. "Sarah," I said again, forcing myself to meet her eyes, "I think I've been lying to you, not about anything specific, just about what this is for me." She didn't interrupt. That alone threw me off because I was expecting at least confusion, maybe discomfort, something to signal that I had already gone too far, but she just waited. So I kept going, even as my chest tightened. "I like you, not just as a friend. And I know that might make things weird, and if it does, I get it. I just didn't want to keep pretending like I'm not." I trailed off because I couldn't even finish the sentence without feeling that old heat crawl up my neck, that reflexive shame telling me I had exposed something I should have kept hidden. I braced for it, the awkward laugh, the polite rejection, the subtle shift that would tell me I had misread everything. Instead, she closed her laptop, set it aside, and looked at me in a way that was so steady it almost disarmed me. "Okay," she said, "just that, okay." It completely threw me. "Okay," I repeated, because my brain didn't know what to do with a response that wasn't negative. She nodded slightly, like this was the most normal thing in the world. "Yeah, I was kind of wondering when you were going to say something." That hit me harder than any rejection would have. "Wait, what?" I asked, genuinely confused now. She gave this small, almost amused smile. "You're not as subtle as you think you are. You just don't follow through, ever." I felt my stomach drop again, but for a completely different reason. "So you knew?" "I had a feeling," she said, "but I didn't want to assume, and I didn't want to push you into saying something you weren't ready to say." That's when something clicked in a way I wasn't prepared for. All that time I thought I was protecting myself by staying silent. I wasn't actually avoiding rejection. I was avoiding people who would have met me halfway. "And the date?" I asked, because that still felt like a ticking clock. She shrugged lightly. "It's just a date. I'm allowed to go on those. But I also like you, if that's what you're actually asking." For a second, I just stood there, trying to process the fact that the outcome I had spent years convincing myself was unrealistic was just happening. No ridicule, no dismissal. No punishment for being honest, just calm, straightforward acceptance. "You like me," I repeated because it still felt unreal. "Yes," she said, a little more firmly this time, "but I'm not going to drag it out of you. If you want something more, you have to actually say it." That was the midpoint for me, the moment where I realized I couldn't retreat back into my usual patterns without actively choosing to lose this. The fear was still there, loud as ever, but it didn't feel like an authority anymore. It felt like background noise I could ignore, so I took a breath and forced the words out clean this time. "I want to date you. No qualifiers, no escape route, just the truth." She held my gaze for a second, then nodded once, like we had just agreed on something simple and obvious. "Okay," she said again, but this time it felt different, like a door opening instead of a neutral response. The tension in my chest didn't vanish instantly, but it shifted into something else, something lighter. Relief maybe, or just the absence of that constant pressure to hide. Later that night, after I left her apartment, I sat in my car for a while just replaying everything, trying to understand why it felt so significant. And the answer was uncomfortable but clear. Shame had never actually been a shield, it was a filter. It kept me away from anyone who might respond like Sarah did, and kept me stuck in situations where silence felt safer because the alternative really would have hurt. But that wasn't universal. I had just been treating it like it was. For the first time, I saw that the risk wasn't feeling something and saying it out loud. The real risk was never giving the right people the chance to prove me wrong. That ending hit hard because the writer finally learned that shame was not protecting him. It was filtering out the very kind of care he had been starving for. Sarah did not punish his honesty, and that is exactly why his old system failed, because he had built it around the wrong idea of safety. It was deeply brave of him to say what he wanted even while his body was still bracing for rejection, because that is how real change begins, not with certainty but with one truthful sentence. The next story turns that same fear into a more mechanical kind of survival, where a person tries to engineer life so carefully that nothing can get in. But when control becomes the only plan, it can also become the thing that keeps love out. Let us read the next story together. I spent years engineering a life where I couldn't get hurt. Then one text message broke the system. I was already halfway through rewriting the message for the 6th time when my phone buzzed with another reminder from Daniel that we were supposed to meet at 7. which meant I had exactly 12 minutes to either send it or back out like I had every other time. And I remember staring at the screen, thinking that this was ridiculous, because I had spent the last 5 years of my life designing everything to avoid this exact moment. And somehow here I was anyway, thumb hovering, heart doing something I had trained it not to do. I met Hannah at a mutual friend's place 2 years ago, and from the beginning I categorized her as unsafe, not because she did anything wrong, but because she made me feel things I could not predict or manage, and my entire life after college had been about eliminating variables, cutting out anything that could introduce uncertainty, especially people. Daniel used to joke that I treated relationships like bad investments, high risk with no guaranteed return, and I leaned into that because it sounded rational, because it sounded like control. I dated casually, I kept conversations shallow, I exited the moment anything started to matter, and I told myself it was discipline, that I was protecting myself from the kind of mess I grew up watching between my parents, where love meant volatility and promises meant nothing. But Hannah did not fit into that system. She was consistent in a way that felt almost suspicious, like she had skipped whatever lesson taught the rest of us to hedge our bets. She would remember things I said months ago, she would check in without an agenda, she would look at me like I was not a problem to solve but a person to know, and every time I felt myself leaning toward that, I pulled back harder, doubling down on my rules. No dependence, no vulnerability, no confession. The illusion worked until it didn't. The catalyst was stupidly small. 2 weeks ago, we were sitting in her car after grabbing coffee, rain tapping against the windshield, and she said, "You know, I never know where I stand with you." And I laughed it off like I always did, deflecting with some joke about being a mystery, but she didn't smile back, she just nodded and said, "That's kind of the problem," and then she drove me home in silence. That silence did something to me that I could not compartmentalize. It sat there, unresolved, like an error in code I could not ignore. I went home and did what I always do when something feels off. I tried to optimize it away. I listed reasons not to care, reasons why staying detached was smarter, safer, more efficient. But every argument felt thinner than the last, and underneath all of it was a realization I had been avoiding for years, that I did need her, not in some desperate, losing myself way, but in a grounded, honest way that made my chest feel exposed. And needing someone meant risk, and risk meant loss, and loss was exactly what I had built my life to avoid. So I did nothing. For almost 2 weeks I kept things normal on the surface, same casual texts, same controlled interactions, but there was this growing pressure under everything, like a system running too many processes at once. Daniel noticed. Of course he did, he always does. We were at the gym when he finally said, "You're going to lose her if you keep pretending you don't care." And I snapped back that there was nothing to lose because there was nothing defined, which sounded logical until he just looked at me and said, "That's the point, man. You never define anything because you're scared of what happens if it's real." I hated that he was right. I hated it because it stripped away the narrative I had been using to justify everything. That night, I opened my phone and typed the message. "Hey, I know I've been kind of distant emotionally, but the truth is I really care about you, and I think I've been too afraid to admit that." It felt like stepping off a ledge just writing it. I rewrote it 5 times, adjusting tone, removing anything that sounded too exposed, adding qualifiers to soften the risk, trying to maintain some illusion of control even in confession. But every version that felt safe also felt dishonest, and I realized that was the whole problem. I had been optimizing for safety at the cost of truth, so I deleted everything and started over. "Hannah, I need to be honest. I've been holding back because I'm scared of how much I actually like you. I didn't want to risk losing control, but I think I've been losing something else instead. If you're still open to it, I want to try, for real this time." I stared at it for a full minute, feeling every instinct in my body telling me to not send it, to preserve the system, to stay in the controlled environment I understood. And then I thought about that silence in her car, about the way she said she didn't know where she stood, and I realized that doing nothing was not neutral. It was a choice with consequences. So I hit send. The next 10 minutes felt longer than the past 5 years. I paced my apartment, checked my phone every few seconds, mentally preparing for every possible negative outcome, rehearsing how I would detach, how I would recover, how I would re-establish control. When her name finally popped up, my stomach dropped so hard I had to sit down. I opened the message expecting ambiguity, maybe a polite rejection, something that would allow me to retreat with minimal damage. Instead, it said, "I've been waiting for you to say that. I really like you too. I just didn't know if you'd ever let yourself." I read it 3 times because it did not fit into any of my prepared scenarios. There was no loss to manage, no damage to contain, just this unexpected, overwhelming sense that I had been wrong about something fundamental. Control had never been protecting me from loss, it had been preventing connection. All the systems, all the rules, all the careful distancing had not made me safer. They had just made me alone in a way that felt rational but hollow. I texted her back. We made plans to meet that same night, and when I saw her in person, there was this moment where everything in me wanted to revert, to pull back, to reassert control, but I didn't. I told her out loud this time that I liked her, that I had been scared, that I was trying to do things differently. She smiled in this way that made it clear she had seen through me for a long time, and instead of feeling exposed in a dangerous way, I felt seen in a way that was grounding. It was not some dramatic, movie-level climax. There was no perfect resolution where all my issues disappeared. What changed was simpler and more unsettling. I realized that the version of safety I had built my life around was incomplete. It minimized risk, yes, but it also eliminated the possibility of something real. Walking home later that night, I caught myself thinking about all the times I had walked away from situations like this, convincing myself I was making the smart choice, and for the first time, I questioned that entire framework. The system I trusted had a flaw I could no longer ignore. It assumed that avoiding loss was the same as winning. It never accounted for what I was losing by not playing at all. And now, standing there with a message thread that proved I had been wrong, I had to decide what to do with that. I wish I could say it fixed everything instantly, that I became this open, fearless version of myself overnight, but that would be another kind of illusion. The truth is, I still feel that instinct to control, to calculate, to protect. The difference is I can see it now for what it is. Not strength, not intelligence, just fear dressed up as strategy. And once you see that, it is a lot harder to keep pretending it is working. That ending with Hannah was powerful because the writer finally saw through his own machinery. All that control felt intelligent on the surface, but it was only fear arranged into neat little systems, and the moment he chose honesty, the whole structure lost its power to keep him alone. He was right to send that message, because pretending not to care was already costing him something precious, and Hannah meeting him with warmth proved that connection was never the real threat. Now we come to one last story, and this one cuts close to the bone, because it is about a man who survived by becoming almost invisible. When someone has spent a lifetime disappearing, even one plain sentence can feel like a revolution. Let us read the next story together. I spent my whole life being invisible until I said one sentence that changed everything. I didn't plan to say it out loud, which is probably why it actually happened, because if I'd given myself even 10 more seconds to think, I would have done what I always do and swallowed it until it disappeared along with every other thing I've ever wanted. But instead I was standing there in the weak yellow light outside the campus library with Daniel next to me, hands in his hoodie pocket, talking about something small and safe, and the words just slipped out before I could cage them again. And the second they did, I felt like I'd just stepped off a ledge I didn't know was there. The weird thing is, this isn't a story about confidence, because I've never had that, not even a little. This is a story about what happens when you get tired of being functionally invisible to everyone around you and decide, just once, to break the rule that kept you safe your entire life. Growing up, I learned early that attention was dangerous, not in some dramatic way, just constant low-grade humiliation that sticks to you. Teachers calling on me and me getting it wrong. Kids laughing when I spoke too quietly or said something slightly off. My dad pointing out every mistake like it was a personal failure, so I adapted the way a lot of people do. I made myself smaller, quieter, easier to overlook, and it worked so well that by the time I got to university, I wasn't just pretending to be invisible, I actually was. I could sit in a lecture hall with 200 people, and no one would remember my face afterward. I could spend weeks around the same group and never get asked a single personal question. And the worst part is, I told myself that was a win, because at least no one was criticizing me anymore. Then Daniel showed up in one of my tutorials, and I noticed him immediately, not because he was loud or confident, but because he had this habit of pausing before he spoke, like he was deciding if his words were worth the risk. And I recognized that hesitation because it was mine too, just packaged differently. And for some reason, I started paying attention to him in a way I didn't allow myself to do with people. I never approached him directly at first. I just positioned myself nearby, sat a seat over, walked out at the same time, added small comments to conversations he was already in, the kind of low-risk interactions that let me exist without fully being seen. And slowly, almost accidentally, we started talking. His name felt strange in my mouth the first few times, like I was overstepping just by saying it, but he never reacted like I was doing something wrong, which confused me more than if he had. Over a few weeks we developed this routine, walking out of class together, grabbing cheap coffee, talking about nothing serious, and I convinced myself that was enough because it was already more than I usually had. But there was this growing pressure in my chest every time we parted ways, this sense that I was standing right at the edge of something I wasn't allowed to touch. The turning point came on a random Thursday when we were studying in the library and he fell asleep for a few minutes, head tilted slightly toward me, and I caught myself just watching him breathe, not in a creepy way, just noticing how unguarded he looked. Like whatever weight he carried dropped off when he wasn't actively holding it up, and the thought hit me so clearly it actually scared me. I wanted to be someone who could protect that, or at least not add to whatever made him so careful all the time. That realization should have sent me running back into my shell, because wanting something that specific means risking losing it, but instead it started building this quiet kind of urgency that I couldn't ignore. Over the next few days I became hyper-aware of every moment we spent together, every almost confession that died in my throat, every time I thought about saying something real, and then defaulted to a joke or a neutral comment, and it started to feel unbearable, like I was actively choosing to erase myself in front of someone who might actually notice if I didn't. So that night outside the library, when he asked if I wanted to grab dinner sometime, casual, friendly, no pressure, something in me snapped, not violently, just a clean break from the pattern I'd followed my whole life, and before I could stop myself I said, "I don't just want to hang out, I want to take you on an actual date." And the second the word date left my mouth, I felt heat rush up my neck and this intense, immediate regret like I'd just ruined the one good connection I had. He went completely still, not pulling away, not reacting at all for what felt like an entire minute, but was probably a few seconds. And my brain filled that silence with every worst-case scenario I'd trained myself to expect, that I'd misread everything. That he'd laugh or politely reject me or just slowly stop talking to me after this. And I was already preparing to backtrack, to say I didn't mean it like that, to make myself small again and undo the damage when he finally spoke. He said my name first, quietly, like he was grounding himself, and then he looked straight at me in a way he hadn't before, not past me or around me, actually at me, and said, "I was starting to think you didn't see me at all." That hit harder than any rejection could have, because the entire time I thought I was protecting myself by staying invisible, I'd also been making him feel the same way, like he didn't matter enough for me to risk anything. And before I could even process that, he added, "I've been waiting for you to say something like that, I just didn't think you ever would." There was no dramatic music moment, no sudden surge of confidence, just this quiet, overwhelming realization that the thing I was most afraid of doing was exactly what made the connection real for both of us, that my vulnerability didn't just expose me, it gave him permission to drop his guard too. We ended up sitting on that curb for over an hour, talking in a way we never had before, about why we both held back, about the small ways we'd learned to disappear to avoid being hurt. And it turned out he had his own version of invisibility, not as extreme as mine, but close enough that he understood it without me having to over-explain. When we finally did go on that date a few days later, it wasn't perfect or cinematic. We were both awkward, both overthinking, both careful, but there was something solid underneath it that hadn't been there before, this mutual understanding that we'd already crossed the hardest line just by being honest. I still catch myself slipping back into old habits sometimes, staying quiet when I should speak, shrinking when I feel exposed. But now I have this proof that the risk actually leads somewhere, that being seen isn't automatically dangerous, and that sometimes the person you're afraid to reveal yourself to is standing there hoping you will. The wildest part is realizing that for years I thought invisibility was armor, but it was also a cage. And the moment I stepped out of it, even just a little, I didn't lose what I had. I finally gained something real. Tonight we walked through so many quiet kinds of pain. We saw what happens when people get laughed at, ignored, left behind, or taught that their feelings are a burden, and we also saw something better. Again and again, the writers found that fear can sound wise for a long time, but it cannot build a peaceful life. Old rules may promise safety, but they often protect loneliness more than they protect the heart. The real turning point came each time a writer stopped hiding, spoke plainly, and let the truth be heard by someone kind enough to handle it with care. That is a gentle reminder for all of us that self-worth does not grow in hiding, and boundaries are not walls built to avoid love. They are steady doors that let the right people enter the right way. If your heart has been tired tonight, let it rest with this thought. You do not have to perform to be worthy, you do not have to disappear to be safe, and you do not have to predict every ending to deserve something real. Take care of yourselves, establish those boundaries early, and sweet dreams, everyone.